I guess one of the advantages of coming on late in the programme is that I can tie up some threads, answer some unanswered questions from yesterday. And I imagine that everybody was awake most of the night trying to remember what happened to the fool in King Lear. So I've made a few notes, I can tell you. Actually, I know we were voicing scepticism about the kind of usefulness of numbers, but if you are a character in King Lear, the chances are that things won't go well for you. Okay, so the fool disappears in Act 3, Scene 6, and as you know, Shakespeare plays have kind of 5 acts, so that's interesting. So what happened to him? So King Lear says near the end of the play, he says, "And my poor fool is hanged." So people ask the question, is he talking about the fool or is he talking about Cordelia? And some people have even asked, was it a custom that the same actor played the fool as played Cordelia, because they're never on stage at the same time together? I just wanted to kind of remind us briefly of the kind of the elements of that, the plot of that play. So King Lear asks his children to kind of put into words how much they love him, and as a kind of response to how much they tell him, he will kind of disperse his land and his kind of wealth to them in proportion. So Goneril says something, "Oh, I can love you more than diamonds," and he says, "Oh, excellent, you can have Wessex," or whatever. And then Regan says, "Oh, I love you more than my white Ford Mondeo," and he says, "Oh, excellent, you can have Essex." But Cordelia doesn't reply, if you remember, and he says in a kind of menacing kind of way, he says, "Cordelia, nothing will come of nothing." In other words, if you don't fill in our questionnaires, you won't get your benefits, you won't get funding for your, nothing will come of nothing. And she replies something like, "I cannot heave my heart into my mouth." I was thinking about this last night, so this play is put on in 1606 or something in the swamps of Southwark in the Globe. So the Londoners that kind of crammed in to see that had kind of, I presume, kind of some sense that there's something kind of integrity to actually say that, rather than to kind of come up with some "I love you this much" to get the dosh. So I thought that is kind of fascinating, really. Anyway, enough of that. I normally give this talk to rooms full of nurses, basically. So I've had to kind of adapt to have to kind of explain certain things. So I've got extra material for you, which I'm going to insert at an appropriate point, entitled "Where Do Nurses Come From?" So just to kind of say that we're all kind of have some kind of idea of some of the kind of background. Right. Okay. Chris Lake, former head of professional development at NHS Leadership Academy, says that when he asks managers up and down the country what qualities they think health service managers need most, they don't tell him compassion or empathy or communication skills. They tell him resilience. Resilience is everywhere. The usually impressive Health Foundation is supporting a scheme run by clinical psychologists to help staff in one NHS organisation to develop resilience. We're trying to promote resilience and give our people the skills and knowledge to be able to cope better with the day-to-day pressures of working in a fast-moving medical environment, says the director of the scheme. She goes on to say, "We do a lot about understanding stress and how we can manage it, helping people learn about their thoughts, their feelings, and their behavioural choices. As the people who run such schemes keep reminding us, psychological health is one of the strongest predictors of sickness absence and intention to leave. It can improve, they say, staff effectiveness at work and can improve patient safety. So resilience looks like the solution to a number of key problems. In the NHS, we hear terms like psychological flexibility, there's mindfulness training, gratefulness training, relaxing music is playing in some schemes, there's acceptance and commitment training. Trusts can send their staff on just 3 half-day sessions to benefit from this training. So you can see why there's such enthusiasm about resilience. So without preempting the later parts of this talk, I can't help but mention 2 consistent features of these articles about resilience. They're in the Nursing Standard and all over the place. So the first feature is that they refer to the NHS financial constraints in an introductory sentence or a passing phrase. And second, the interventions that they're offering are all individual. As far as I can see, there's no concept of what you might call organisational resilience, and if there is, it's simply kind of individualised versions of resilience, just kind of repeated across individuals and managers maybe. So let's return to Chris Lake, who is one writer who doesn't ignore the context. He goes on to say, the NHS is suffering from 10 years of flatline funding, down from 7.4% of gross domestic product in comparison to other countries where it's about 11%. Demand is increasing 4% a year, ever higher patient expectations, a social care system starved of funding, and a management culture of demand and command rather than compassion and care. That's his diagnosis. There's also the telling statistic that last year 3,000 more nurses left the NHS than joined, and that many of those who are leaving are young, under 40. We might also add that the NHS appears to be controlled and funded by a government that has, at best, an ambiguous commitment to welfare values, and that has at various points seen strong professional groups as part of the problem with the NHS. Jeremy Hunt was one of a number of authors whose 2005 pamphlet set out, "Our ambition should be to break down the barriers between private and public provision, in effect, denationalising the provision of healthcare in Britain." Simon Stevens, head of NHS England, has a career featuring privatisations and was an executive in the US United Health group of companies before his appointment, now overseeing the reorganisation of the NHS into 44 Sustainability and Transformation Plans, STPs, allowing, as Jeremy Hunt acknowledged in public, American-style healthcare funding and delivery to happen more easily. People keep saying that the NHS is being run on the goodwill of its staff. But is it too far-fetched to wonder that if the goodwill of those staff can be broken down bit by bit, the public might be just slightly more willing to accept drastic solutions to a crisis, a nicely manufactured crisis. So what should we do about that if we're committed to the founding principles of the NHS and see them being carefully eroded in a way that makes it increasingly difficult to deliver safe and humane care? Send more nurses on gratefulness training? Is that the long-term solution to this problem? The promoters of resilience training think that this political context can simply be sidestepped. At a recent event I attended on the theme of resilience, organised by the Royal College of Nursing, a member of the audience who had until recently worked as a district nurse in the UK spoke up. She told us that she had a caseload of over 200 patients, and that a total of 9 of her patients had died during one single shift. Understandably traumatized by this experience, she told us how she asked her managers if there was any support available to her. The reply we heard was that she should do some resilience training. She went on to tell us how she subsequently discovered that a large number of her colleagues in her team were taking antidepressants to cope with the demands of their jobs. Soon after this, she said, she was diagnosed with PTSD and resigned. Okay, let me just, before I go further, just talk a little bit about nursing as an occupation. I've got it, some features of nursing. Okay, the first thing I think is there are lots of them. Like even when there's so many unfilled posts, there are lots of them. And they make up the largest clinical workforce of most health services. But workforce planning is poor. So when budgets are cut, nurse training numbers are the first thing amongst the first things to suffer. And then, of course, 3 years later, when there aren't enough nurses, it's kind of followed by recruitment drives to far-flung corners of the world, heavy use of agency staff. So workforce planning is considered to be poor. In the late 19th century and early decades of the 20th century, the professionalising leaders of nursing looked to medicine as their model of a kind of successful profession. Nevertheless, in a study published in the early 1960s, nursing was grouped together with other predominantly female occupations, teaching and social work, and given the label semi-professions. Maybe you're familiar with that. In other words, despite some boosts to its remit and status during the Blair years, if you remember the nurse consultant, similar, and expansions, to be able to prescribe certain things. Despite that, it remains a relatively unpowerful group within the NHS. In terms of its preparation, nurse education moved into universities as recently as the 1990s. Before that, you could describe preparation as a kind of broadly apprenticeship. And there's every sign that it's going to return to that kind of workplace-based system in the future. So that kind of gives you a sense of its precarious status as a profession. Partly as a response to that, nursing's emphasised its difference to medicine and identifies itself with caring as its core activity and value. There's this phrase, doctors cure, nurses care. That's a kind of repeated. But it's looked to in a kind of imprecise and actually sometimes unhelpful way. Unhelpful because the constraints can easily lead to a kind of disillusionment. If you remember, there's kind of the Stafford scandal. So the poor nursing care at Stafford General Hospital and the resulting Francis report provoked a crisis of confidence in the profession and a restatement from nursing's leaders of its core values. And the chief nurse talked about these 6 C's. We were trying to remember what they are last night. We could only remember compassion was one of them. So that was the kind of response. Right. Okay, this is material that you probably know better than I do. So how did the idea of resilience first gain popularity, at least in its current form? This is my understanding. It was child psychologists and psychoanalysts working from the 1980s, I believe, onwards, who were puzzled by the observation that some children from tough backgrounds appeared to succumb to their problematic origins, while others seemed to escape the harmful influence and apparently thrive. Their work had its origins in the ideas of Sigmund Freud, widely considered the founder of psychoanalysis. Okay, you know that. An analyst said to me, if I were to describe Sigmund Freud as the father of psychoanalysis. Everybody would laugh. It was kind of an in-joke. Okay, clearly I'm not getting good advice about that. In the early days, some writers talked about invulnerable children, and E. James Anthony published a book of that name. But soon they swapped this awkward description for the term resilient. So their model was that protective factors modified the impact of adversity on children, leading them to emerge in different ways. These protective factors could be operating at the neighbourhood, school, family or individual levels and operated in an interacting way. Actions aimed at improving resilience tended to be community-focused. In fact, early researchers in the field had the foresight to warn that the concept of resilience could be misused by policymakers and politicians as an excuse to withdraw services and encourage the socially disadvantaged to simply shape up. However, as psychologists brought their methodology and techniques of individual measurement to bear within the field, an approach emerged where the communal dimensions of investigations into resilience were dropped. Many researchers focused purely on the attempt to measure this mysterious resilience by means of the psychological questionnaires that we're all familiar with. This kind of investigation into so-called resilience has a different flavour to the more holistic research into environments and the individuals and groups within them. So one team of researchers, who I guess you'd call more holistic, wrote, "Many characteristics that appear to reside in the child are in fact continually shaped by interactions between the child and aspects of his or her environment." But an apparently subtle change in emphasis started to open the way for a contemporary vision of resilience training as an alternative to social change. So these two kind of quotes just really strike me as significant from two different teams of researchers. So the first is, some sources of adversity are preventable, such as child maltreatment, and it's far more effective to try to prevent these in the first place. Compare that to the second quote. The primary concern of those working with children and adolescents at risk is the prevention of maltreatment and abuse. But given that this is not always possible, the promotion of resilience is even more valuable. Okay, so with this very brief history in mind, it comes as little surprise to see that the clinical psychologists, who are often running resilience training for NHS staff, fail to really examine the policy and political factors causing the supposed need for resilience in the first place. I would be interested to know what you think about this. It seems their whole training and orientation is towards the individual. In fact, I published an editorial in a journal talking about this kind of stuff, and the editor got a letter from a team of psychologists and others working on resilience, who kind of disagreed, and part of their letter said, I quote it, "Individuals have a professional responsibility to maintain and build personal responsibility." Okay, I hope this part of the talk interests you. I wanted to see what kind of nursing's researchers made of resilience and the kind of work that they'd done with nurses as their kind of subjects on this topic. To explain, nurse researchers, people researching into nursing, for the most part are nurses themselves. So I just need to mention that. So research into resilience in nursing is a growing field. I won't go on to describe the details of each paper that I looked at, but I want to kind of tell you that this body of writing has some features, and I think I'd call them unhelpful features. I don't know how far they might apply to writing on resilience in other fields or amongst other professional groups. So I'd be interested to hear your views on that. Okay. So these are, I think, five features. So the first is that there's an assumption that for the nurse to remain in the nursing workforce is a free choice, and that's evidence of resilience, that some of those who remain at the bedside apparently thrive on the adversity they experience. There's also an assumption that a decision to leave nursing can be understood as succumbing to adversity, i.e. a negative consequence, a sign of pathology. None of the work that I've read entertains the possibility that nurses might remain in nursing because of a lack of local alternatives or personal circumstances, or that leaving the profession could be seen as a sign of strength, a healthy and appropriate response, a sign of well-being, as everyone is talking about at the moment. Secondly, many nurse researchers seem unaware of the history and debates within earlier resilience studies. Definitions of resilience in this literature show an over-reliance on other research written by nurses and perpetuate a partial understanding of the term. The nursing literature tends to draw on an internal understanding of resilience as a positive personality characteristic, or as a skill to learn, a bit like aseptic technique. Okay, for me, this is the crucial problem of this kind of literature, this way of thinking. So crucially, authors fail to differentiate between two different types of adversity that affect nurses. The first type of adversity is to do with having to deal with patient suffering and death and the close relationships that may develop with these patients. The second group of adversities, which is referred to in rather longer lists in this literature, includes global nursing shortages and high turnover, political change and under-resourcing of public health care, casualisation, staff shortages, bullying, abuse and violence. The first type of adversity, you could say, is intrinsic to nursing work. The second can be seen as the direct effect of under-resourcing, political ideology, poor management, dysfunctional and insecure organisations, disempowered nurse managers, sexism, racism in the workplace, that all result in understaffing, perhaps, and high turnover. All of these problems, you might think it not unreasonable, require action to address them, not the encouragement of nurses to thrive on them. So while adversity in this literature is understood in these kind of organisational and workforce terms, there's little attempt to consider or measure this. The focus within this literature is almost entirely on individual, personal response and characteristics. Most of these studies are carried out in single sites, so there's no opportunity to investigate whether any differences in resilience are associated with different ways of working, rather than differences in individuals. There's no conception or consideration of resilience systems in the nursing literature. This also is a kind of really a troubling characteristic for me. There's a tacit acknowledgement of powerlessness from the authors, and that the workplace experienced by nurses is so dysfunctional that it is better to invest energy in devising personal approaches to coping than investigating or challenging the causes of dysfunction. Promoting resilience among nurses is a way, according to many of the authors, of reducing turnover in the nursing workforce, with the promise that nurses can thrive at the bedside for extended periods of time. According to some presumably well-meaning authors, the measurement of resilience can be used to identify those nurses with low resilience and target them for support to help them to last longer. Many authors repeat in the introduction to their studies the unempowering yet familiar mantra of resilience. You can't often choose what happens to you, but you can choose how you react. Paradoxically, at the same time as configuring the individual as one who bears responsibility to cope, these researchers seem uninterested in talking to the individual to find out what adversity or protective factors mean to them with their unique history. In this literature, there are no individuals, just a procession of subjects, identical in every way, apart from their score on resilience subscales. I want to suggest to you that the promotion of resilience is a child of its time. Its focus on individual responsibility and the way it neglects consideration of structural factors resonates with the global political tendency towards neoliberalism. We've discussed it at length, but let's remind ourselves, in case we forgot overnight. So what do we mean by neoliberalism? It starts with a political belief in the apparent operation of markets, of more or less free trade, to work to the benefit of all involved. State interference is problematic. Along with this comes a strong focus on individuals in the form of placing responsibility on individuals to avoid risk and make the most of opportunities to maximise their health, prosperity and independence. People have used the term responsibilisation because basically the state is no longer going to be involved. And when individual companies or individuals fail, it's a great motivating example for everyone else. The phenomenon of resilience training perpetuates a contemporary mindset that promotes the naturalness of the individual bearing responsibility for situations that are the making of others. If you've had any involvement with nursing's professional culture, you will know that one of nursing's worst tendencies is to cope, or rather to acquiesce to gradually increased pressure and falling standards. There's a whole field of libidinal pleasure in repetitions of martyrdom in nursing. That's another fascinating story. I believe that policymakers and managers have come to rely on this professional flexibility. Under immense pressure themselves, they end up exploiting it. In the writing about resilience, like neoliberalism itself, the possibility of collective activity, resistance, challenge, systemic change is simply absent from the horizon of possibilities. And that it's an alternative to this popular idea of resilience that I'm labelling critical resilience. And I want to outline briefly what I think that might be before I end this talk. I haven't worked out every detail of this, and I don't think the approach that I'm about to suggest addresses the unconscious aspects of organisational life. But I've been talking about it as an attempt to put into professional debate and discourse something different to the unhelpful talk about resilience. Perhaps it's a plan for resistance within any toxic organisation. Actually, I must mention this book cover. So those of you who kind of published kind of in academic publishers know that usually their covers are kind of dreadful. And I was afraid that they would put kind of bending bamboo on the front of this book. So I kind of wrote a note to the publisher saying, it's a book about kind of nurse activism. And then they came up with this cover, which I think is brilliant. I don't know if there's anybody kind of from kind of nursing here in the audience. If I were to say to you, that this cover has become highly controversial. Would you know what I was talking about? Recently, the head of the RCN had to resign because there's a scandal about the pay award and how they represented it poorly to the membership. And there was a movement, a kind of grassroots movement among membership to call for all of the kind of senior kind of management in the RCN to kind of stand down. And who was behind this kind of call, or one of the leading kind of forces? This person here on the cover. Yeah. Okay. When speaking to audiences of nurses, I've explored this idea of critical resilience as a positive response in difficult circumstances. So critical resilience is about first understanding ourselves and our experiences in relation to our society, to take a phrase from feminist consciousness-raising groups. The combination of becoming informed about the political and policy forces acting on day-to-day working life with frank, mutually supportive discussion can develop critical resilience. Neither on its own, I'd suggest, is enough. Getting informed by reading a radical nursing blog on health policy or on the latest initiative from nursing's regulatory body, for example, is just the starting point for responding. And discussion among colleagues without information can too easily turn into complaint, where the pleasure is not in the creative energy released by analysis and planning to do something, but in simply repeating expressions of suffering. Nurses, and I sometimes say we in this kind of talk, need to focus our energies on understanding and analysing events and their causes, rather than surrendering to a feeling of generalised martyrdom. Critique is a practice that demands a rigorous engagement with its object. It's also productive because it can lead to action. I suggest that nurses explore the possibility of setting up groups with fellow students, if they're students, or with colleagues, to develop informed critiques about aspects of working life. These could be place-based or asynchronous, a term to describe social media and web-based discussion and support forums that are present even for nurses who are isolated in whatever way. Becoming an active member of a trade union is clearly part of this project. Consciousness raising is the first step to action. First, we raise our own consciousness, and then we can raise awareness of a particular issue among wider colleagues and perhaps local public or nationally. I'm aware that such a project will encounter opposition and attempts to belittle those who resist from within the profession itself, from managers and perhaps the media. There will also be indifference, which is probably worse. We need to turn our critique towards understanding the causes of that opposition. Vested interest, fear perhaps. In my book, I wrote a chapter about the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, whose work can provide a theoretical basis for such a project for those who are in search of this. There's a section in the book on handling experiences of bullying from the same principle of understanding context. And there are some ideas from creative writing groups about the difference between criticism and critique. So, getting together and getting informed are the twin foundations for developing critical resilience. The second step is raising consciousness within wider groups. The third step is change. So, to summarise, I see the current promotion of resilience as a purely individualistic attempt to mitigate systemic problems, and it has some elements of a fad. Individual nurses, and others clearly, are being asked to take responsibility for political decisions and the resulting systematic organisational failures. The promotion of resilience covers over more complex and disturbing issues for the individual and for organisations. You could say that this is one reason why it's so popular. The individual is left to deal with issues themselves when developing so-called resilience fails to deal with them. And the organisation can tick the box of doing something for the well-being of its workforce, but never really solves any of its problems. The individualising work of clinical psychologists can be seen in this instance as the perfect modus operandi of the neoliberal state. But there is an alternative, characterised by collective consciousness raising and action. Thank you very much.